She only meant to sign some papers and leave, but one dance under the Harvest Festival lights was enough for Grace to fall for a stranger with an intense gaze. What she didn't know? He was Matthew Carter, the man who had sworn to hate anyone with her last name. And what he didn't expect? That one forbidden night would change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the endless fields of Carter Ranch, painting the Texas landscape in shades of gold and amber. Matthew Carter stood on his wraparound porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying the empire he had built from ashes. At 32, he commanded respect throughout Fredericksburg and beyond, a self-made millionaire whose vast cattle ranch stretched as far as the eye could see. But respect came at a price. The weathered oak boards beneath his boots creaked as he shifted his weight, a sound that always reminded him of his father's footsteps. Thomas Carter had walked these same boards 20 years ago, back when hope still lived in this house, back before Richard Whitmore destroyed everything. Matthew's jaw tightened at the memory. The Whitmore name was poison in his veins, a curse that had cost him more than land and cattle. It had cost him his brother. David Carter had been the dreamer of the family, full of plans and promises about expanding the ranch, maybe even starting a family of his own. When the lawyers came with their papers and their corporate shell companies, when they proved that Richard Whitmore had legally, if immorally, seized the Carter family ranch through a web of legal technicalities, David had fought harder than anyone. He'd spent months in courtrooms, drowning in legal fees they couldn't afford, watching their legacy slip away, document by document. The heart attack took him on a Tuesday morning, 28 years old, and the fight had literally killed him. Matthew drained his coffee, the bitter taste matching his mood. He'd rebuilt everything, bigger, stronger, untouchable, but the cost of that rebuilding was a heart that trusted no one and needed nothing from anyone else. Mr. Carter. He turned to see Miguel Rodriguez, his ranch foreman, approaching with the kind of cautious expression that usually meant trouble. Miguel had worked for the Carter family for 15 years, one of the few people Matthew genuinely trusted. "What is it, Miguel?" "The Johnson fence line needs repair again. That storm last week did more damage than we thought." Miguel paused, studying Matthew's face. "You've been standing out here for an hour, boss. Something on your mind? If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion." Matthew almost smiled. Miguel knew him too well. "Just thinking about the Harvest Festival next week. You know how I feel about crowds. You could skip it this year, folks would understand." But Matthew shook his head. The Harvest Festival was tradition, and tradition mattered in a place like Fredericksburg. Besides, his presence meant something to the community. The Carter name still carried weight, even if it was weight built on loss. "No, we go. The ranch needs to maintain its relationships." He handed Miguel the empty mug. "Get the boys started on that fence. I want it done before the weekend." As Miguel walked away, Matthew remained on the porch, his mind wandering to places he rarely allowed it to go. Sometimes, in the quiet morning hours like this, he wondered what his life might have been like if things had gone differently. If the Whitmores had never existed, if David had lived, if Matthew had learned to trust, to love, to build something beyond just a successful business. But those were dangerous thoughts. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and love was a weakness that destroyed good men. He'd seen what happened when you let your guard down, when you believed in people who only wanted to use you. The Whitmore name was a reminder carved into his soul. Never again. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. Matthew watched it soar, envying its solitude. Hawks didn't need anyone. They hunted alone, survived alone, thrived alone. That was the only way to live. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably a supplier or one of the contractors working on the new barn. Matthew ignored it. Whatever it was could wait. Right now, he needed these few moments of peace before the day demanded his attention. The Texas wind carried the scent of grass and cattle, familiar smells that usually comforted him. But today, something felt different, restless, like change was coming whether he wanted it or not. Matthew shook off the feeling. Change was the enemy of control, and control was everything. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, paid for it with blood and grief and years of sleepless nights. As he turned to head back inside, his gaze swept across the fields one more time. Somewhere out there, beyond his carefully maintained borders, life was happening to other people. People fell in love, started families, took chances on happiness. But not Matthew Carter. Never Matthew Carter. He had his land, his cattle, and his carefully constructed walls. It was enough. It had to be enough. The Dallas mansion felt like a mausoleum, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers that caught the afternoon light, but never seemed to warm the spaces they illuminated. Grace Whitmore sat in the window seat of her childhood bedroom, watching the perfectly manicured gardens below where not a single leaf dared to fall out of place. At 21, she had never known true freedom. Every minute of her life had been choreographed by her father's expectations and her stepmother's suffocating attention to appearances. Even now, Charlotte's voice echoed from downstairs, directing the household staff with the precision of a military commander. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. Sometimes she could almost remember her mother, soft hands braiding her hair, gentle laughter filling rooms that now felt hollow. But those memories were fading, replaced by the stark reality of life under Richard Whitmore's roof. Her father ruled his empire with an iron fist, and his family was just another asset to be managed. Grace's education, her social connections, even her charity work, everything was calculated to enhance the Whitmore name. She was a carefully polished piece in his grand design, and she was suffocating under the weight of it. "Grace, darling, are you ready?" Charlotte's voice carried up the stairs, sweet as honey and twice as artificial. "The lawyer will be here any moment." Grace sighed and rose from the window seat. Today brought yet another tedious appointment, something about property her mother had left her. She'd been barely 5 when Eleanor Whitmore died, and the idea that her mother had owned anything separate from Richard's vast holdings seemed almost impossible. She chose a simple navy dress and pearl earrings, knowing Charlotte would inspect her appearance before allowing her to meet with anyone. Image was everything in the Whitmore household. "There you are," Charlotte smiled as Grace descended the marble staircase. Her stepmother was beautiful in the way magazine covers were beautiful, flawless but cold. "Remember, darling, you're a Whitmore. Posture straight, smile gracious." This lawyer represents a very small matter, but still, "I understand," Grace interrupted gently. She'd heard this speech 1,000 times. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, was a kind man in his 60s with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He sat across from Grace in her father's intimidating study, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the room's aggressive displays of wealth and power. "Miss Whitmore," he began carefully, glancing at Charlotte, who had insisted on staying, "your mother left you a small piece of property in Fredericksburg, about 15 acres of farmland." Grace felt her heart skip. "Farmland? Nothing significant," Charlotte interjected quickly. "Eleanor had some sentimental attachments to rural areas. It's probably worthless now." But Mr. Henderson shook his head. "Actually, the land has maintained its value quite well. It includes a small farmhouse, nothing elaborate but structurally sound. Your mother's will specified that it should come to you on your 21st birthday." He slid a folder across the desk. "These are the property documents and keys." Grace stared at the folder as if it might disappear. Land, a house, something that had belonged to her mother, something that was truly hers. "I'd like to see it," she said quietly. "Grace, don't be ridiculous," Charlotte laughed, but there was tension in the sound. "What would you possibly want with some ramshackle farm in the middle of nowhere? We'll have Henderson sell it immediately." "No." The word came out stronger than Grace had intended. Both women looked at her in surprise. "I mean, I'd like to see it first, before making any decisions." Mr. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Very wise. The property is about an hour and a half from here. I could arrange for you to visit this weekend if you'd like." "The Harvest Festival," Charlotte said suddenly, her voice sharp. "That little farming community has their festival this weekend. Grace, you can't possibly want to be seen at such a rustic event." But for the first time in years, Grace felt something stirring in her chest that might have been excitement. A place that had belonged to her mother. A place where she could breathe, even if only for a day. "I think I'd like that very much," she said. After Mr. Henderson left, Charlotte cornered Grace in the hallway, her mask of sweetness slipping. "Your father won't approve of this little adventure, you know. He has plans for you. Important plans. The Blackwood family is interested in an alliance, and their son Jonathan is quite taken with you. Grace felt the familiar weight settling on her chest. Jonathan Blackwood was handsome, wealthy, and utterly boring. He looked at her the way her father looked at his prize horses, as something valuable to be acquired. I'm just going to look at the property, Charlotte. One day. One day can change everything, Grace. One moment of poor judgment can destroy years of careful planning. Charlotte's voice was silk wrapped around steel. Your father has worked very hard to build what we have. Don't disappoint him with childish whims. That night, Grace lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, the property folder clutched against her chest. Through her window, she could see the city lights stretching endlessly in all directions, beautiful, but somehow lifeless. Somewhere out there, in a place called Fredericksburg, was a farmhouse that had belonged to her mother. For the first time in her life, she would own something that hadn't been chosen for her, controlled by her father, or approved by Charlotte. She thought about the harvest festival Charlotte had mentioned with such disdain. Grace had never been to anything so informal, so real. The events in her world were charity galas and business dinners where every word was measured and every smile calculated. What would it be like to dance without being watched, to laugh without being judged, to be just Grace, not Grace Whitmore, daughter of the ruthless Richard Whitmore? Tomorrow she would find out. For the first time in years, Grace fell asleep with something that felt like hope warming her heart. The Fredericksburg Harvest Festival was nothing like the sterile perfection of Grace's world. Paper lanterns swayed between oak trees, casting dancing shadows across faces flushed with laughter and genuine joy. The air was thick with the scent of barbecue and apple cider, and a local band played country melodies that seemed to make everyone's feet move instinctively. Grace stood at the edge of the festivities, feeling like she'd stepped into a painting. She'd chosen her most casual dress, a soft cream cotton sundress that Charlotte would have deemed inappropriate for public appearance, and for the first time in her life, she felt almost invisible in the best possible way. The farmhouse visit had been everything she'd hoped for and more. The small white building with its wraparound porch and wildflower garden had felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. Standing in the kitchen where her mother had once cooked meals, touching the windowsill where Eleanor's favorite roses still bloomed, Grace had felt a connection to something real and lasting. Now, watching families dance and neighbors embrace like old friends, she understood why her mother had loved this place. First time at the festival, Grace turned to find a woman about her age with kind eyes and flower-dusted hands. Is it that obvious? Only because you look like someone seeing magic for the first time, the woman laughed. I'm Sarah Mitchell. My family runs the bakery in town. Grace, she replied, deliberately omitting her last name. Grace. Eleanor. It felt strange using her mother's name, but also right somehow. Tonight, she didn't want to be a Whitmore. Tonight, she wanted to be someone else entirely. Well, Grace Eleanor, you can't just stand here watching. The whole point is to join in. Sarah grabbed her hand. Come on, they're about to start the partner dancing. Before Grace could protest, she found herself swept into the crowd, just as the band began a slow, haunting melody. Couples paired off around them, and Grace suddenly felt exposed and uncertain. I don't really know how to... May I? The voice was deep, warm, and sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Grace looked up to find herself staring into the most intense blue eyes she'd ever seen. The man before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered hands and dark hair that caught the lantern light. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her forget every rule about talking to strangers. Yes, she managed. His hand was warm and slightly calloused as it enveloped hers, and when he placed his other hand gently on her waist, Grace felt her breath catch. She'd danced at dozens of formal events, but this felt entirely different. This felt dangerous and thrilling and absolutely right. I haven't seen you around here before, he said as they began to move to the music. His voice held the hint of a Texas drawl that made her pulse quicken. I'm just visiting. You? Born and raised. His eyes never left her face. What brings you to our little corner of the world? Grace hesitated. How could she explain the desperate need to escape? The hunger for something real, the feeling that her entire life had been a beautiful lie. I inherited some property here. I wanted to see it. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. And what do you think of our corner of the world? It's... Grace looked around at the festival, at the genuine happiness on every face, at the way this stranger held her like she was something precious. It's like coming home to a place I've never been. His grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. I know exactly what you mean. The music swirled around them, and Grace felt herself getting lost in the moment. When was the last time she'd felt this alive? When had anyone looked at her the way this man was looking at her? Not as Richard Whitmore's daughter or Charlotte's project, but as herself. "What's your name?" she whispered. "Matt," he said, spinning her gently before pulling her back against him. The movement brought them closer together, and Grace could feel the heat radiating from his body. "And yours?" "Grace. Just Grace." She loved how it sounded when he said it, like something precious rather than something to be managed. "Grace," he repeated, and the way his voice wrapped around her name made her knees weak. "It suits you." The song began to wind down, but neither of them moved to separate. Grace could feel his thumb tracing small circles on her hand, and the simple touch was setting her entire nervous system on fire. "Would you like to walk with me?" Matt asked. "There's something I'd like to show you." Every instinct Charlotte had drilled into her screamed that nice girls didn't go off alone with strangers. But Grace found herself nodding, because nothing about this felt like a mistake. This felt like the first right decision she'd made in her entire life. He led her away from the crowd, down a path lined with wildflowers that glowed silver in the moonlight. The music faded to a gentle backdrop, replaced by the symphony of crickets and the distant sound of a creek. "It's beautiful here," Grace said, acutely aware of his hand still holding hers. "My favorite place in the world," Matt agreed, but when she looked at him, he was watching her instead of the landscape. "Grace, I know this might sound crazy, but I feel like I've been waiting to meet you my whole life." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they filled her with a warmth that started in her chest and spread through her entire body. "I feel it too," she whispered. Matt stopped walking and turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, he looked like something from a dream, strong and gentle and impossibly handsome. When he reached up to cup her face in his hands, Grace felt her heart stop. "I don't even know your last name," he said softly. "Does it matter?" For a moment, something shadowed his expression. Then it was gone, replaced by a hunger that made Grace's breath catch. "No," he said. "Nothing else matters." When he kissed her, it was like the world tilted on its axis. His lips were warm and gentle at first, questioning, and when Grace responded by pressing closer, the kiss deepened into something that stole her breath and her sense of reason. She'd been kissed before, chaste pecks at charity events, calculated displays of affection from approved suitors. But this was entirely different. This was fire and desire, and a connection so intense it frightened her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matt rested his forehead against hers. "Come home with me," he whispered. And Grace, who had never made an impulsive decision in her life, found herself saying yes. Matt's truck rumbled down the dark country road. The silence between them charged with anticipation and something deeper, something that felt like destiny. Grace sat beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stole glances at his profile. The dashboard lights cast shadows across his strong jaw, and every time he shifted gears, she was acutely aware of the strength in his hands. What was she doing? This wasn't her. She didn't go home with strangers, didn't throw caution to the wind, didn't trust her heart over her head. But sitting here beside Matt, feeling more alive than she had in 21 years, Grace couldn't bring herself to care about the rules that had governed her entire life. "You're quiet," Matt observed, his voice gentle in the darkness. "I'm thinking." "About?" Grace turned to look at him fully, taking in the way the moonlight caught in his dark hair, the careful way he held himself as if he was fighting the same internal battle she was. "About how I've never done anything like this before." Matt's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "We can turn around. I can take you back to your car, no questions asked." The offer was sincere, and somehow that made Grace want him even more. "Is that what you want?" He pulled the truck to the side of the road and turned to face her, his blue eyes intense in the dashboard light. "What I want and what's smart are two very different things." "Then let's not be smart tonight." Something in Matt's expression shifted, a wall crumbling that had probably taken years to build. He reached across the space between them and cupped her face in his palm, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "You're dangerous, Grace." "So are you." This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation. His mouth was hungry and demanding, and Grace responded with a passion she didn't know she possessed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matt rested his forehead against hers. "My ranch is just ahead," he said quietly. "Then take me home." The Carter ranch house was nothing like the Whitmore mansion, and Grace loved it instantly. It was built for comfort rather than intimidation, with worn leather furniture and family photos that spoke of lives actually lived, rather than carefully curated. Matt led her through the living room to the kitchen, suddenly seeming nervous. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Water?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that Grace was already finding endearing. "Matt." She stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "I don't want coffee." The air between them crackled with tension. Matt's eyes darkened as he looked down at her, and Grace could see the internal struggle playing across his features. "I need you to be sure," he said roughly, "because once I start touching you, I'm not going to want to stop." Grace rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his neck, feeling him shudder beneath her touch. "I'm sure." Matt's control snapped. He swept her up in his arms, carrying her through the house to his bedroom, with an urgency that made Grace's pulse race. When he set her down beside his bed, his hands were gentle, but shaking slightly. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "So damn beautiful." Grace had been called beautiful countless times, by suitors, by her father's business associates, by Charlotte when she needed to make a good impression. But the way Matt said it, like it was torn from somewhere deep inside him, made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. She reached for the buttons of his shirt, her fingers fumbling slightly in her nervousness. Matt caught her hands, stilling them. "Hey," he said softly. "We go slow. We go at your pace." The tenderness in his voice almost undid her. Grace had expected passion, desire, maybe even conquest. She hadn't expected this careful reverence, this sense that she was something precious to be cherished rather than taken. "I've never," she began, then stopped, embarrassed. Understanding dawned in Matt's eyes. "Never." Grace shook her head, expecting judgment or disappointment. Instead, Matt pulled her close, holding her against his chest. "Then we definitely go slow," he murmured against her hair. "This should be perfect for you. You deserve perfect." What followed was the most beautiful night of Grace's life. Matt worshipped her body with a patience and gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. Every touch was reverent, every kiss a promise. When he finally made love to her, it was with such exquisite care that Grace understood why they called it making love rather than anything else. Afterward, she lay curled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow to normal. Matt's fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and Grace had never felt so safe, so cherished, so completely right. "What are you thinking?" Matt asked, his voice rough with satisfaction. "That I never want to leave." His arms tightened around her. "Then don't." They talked through the night, about dreams and fears and all the small details that make up a life. Grace found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone, and Matt shared stories about growing up on the ranch, about the weight of family legacy, about the loneliness of building success with no one to share it with. "I feel like I've known you forever," Grace whispered as dawn began to creep through the windows. "Maybe you have," Matt replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Maybe we were always meant to find each other." As the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of pink and gold, Grace allowed herself to believe in fairy tales. She'd found her place, her person, her home. The farmhouse her mother had left her was just 15 minutes down the road. It felt like a sign, like Eleanor had known this would happen and had given her daughter the gift of belonging. Grace dozed in Matt's arms, dreaming of a future she'd never dared imagine. A future where love was real and trust was possible, and happiness didn't come with strings attached. She had no way of knowing that in just a few hours her fairy tale would shatter into 1,000 pieces. But for now, wrapped in the arms of the man she was already falling in love with, Grace Whitmore had never been happier in her life. Grace woke to the sound of movement in the kitchen below and the rich aroma of coffee drifting through the old farmhouse. For a moment she lay still in Matt's bed, wrapped in his scent and the memory of the most perfect night of her life. Sunlight streamed through the windows, painting everything in golden hues that matched the warmth spreading through her chest. She could hear Matt moving around downstairs, probably making breakfast, and the domesticity of it made her heart flutter. This was what normal people did. They woke up together, shared morning coffee, talked about their plans for the day. It was everything Grace had never known she wanted. Slipping into Matt's discarded shirt from the night before, she padded barefoot down the stairs, following the sounds and smells to the kitchen. The sight that greeted her made her breath catch. Matt stood at the stove, his back to her, wearing only jeans that hung low on his hips. The morning light highlighted every muscle in his shoulders and back, and Grace felt her pulse quicken at the memory of running her hands over that same skin just hours before. "Good morning," she said softly. Matt turned, and the smile that spread across his face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Good morning, beautiful. Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years." Grace moved to him, rising on her tiptoes to press a gentle kiss to his lips. The simple intimacy of it, morning breath and all, felt more romantic than any grand gesture she'd ever experienced. "I made coffee," Matt said, wrapping his arms around her waist. "And I was thinking about pancakes, if you're interested in staying for breakfast." "I'm very interested in staying for breakfast," Grace replied, then felt heat flood her cheeks at how that sounded. I know what you mean," Matt chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And for the record, I'm very interested in you staying for breakfast too. And lunch, and dinner." The words sent a thrill through Grace that she tried to temper with reality. This was one night, one perfect night. She had to go back to Dallas eventually, back to her father's expectations and Charlotte's plans, and the life that had been mapped out for her since birth. But looking at Matt, feeling the way he held her like she was precious, Grace found herself believing that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. "What's that look?" Matt asked, studying her face with those impossibly blue eyes. "I was just thinking about how different this is from my normal life." "Different how?" Grace gestured around the kitchen, taking in the lived-in warmth of it all. "Everything. This house, this feeling, you. I've never felt so." She searched for the right word. "Free." Something flickered in Matt's expression. Pain, maybe, or understanding. Freedom's a precious thing. Not everyone gets to choose their own path. Have you? Chosen your own path, I mean. Matt was quiet for a moment, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. "I thought I had. I built this ranch from nothing, made my own success, answered to no one." He handed her a mug, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "But meeting you, it makes me wonder if I've been choosing isolation instead of freedom." Grace felt her heart skip. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe the bravest choice isn't building walls to keep people out. Maybe it's letting the right person in." Before Grace could respond, the distant sound of a car engine broke the morning quiet. Matt frowned, moving to the window. "Expecting someone?" Grace asked. "No, Matt's entire body went rigid. The coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. "No." "Matt? What's wrong?" But he was already moving, grabbing a shirt from the back of a chair and pulling it on with jerky, angry movements. Grace followed his gaze out the window and saw a sleek black sedan pulling up the driveway, the kind of car that screamed money and power. "You need to go," Matt said, his voice completely changed. Cold, distant. "Now." "What? Why? Who is that?" Matt turned to face her, and Grace's breath caught at the transformation. The warm, tender man who had held her all night was gone, replaced by someone hard and furious and completely closed off. "What's your last name?" he demanded. The question hit Grace like a physical blow. "What? Your last name? What is it?" Grace stared at him, confusion and hurt warring in her chest. "Why does it matter? You said it didn't matter. Answer the question." The car outside had stopped, and Grace could hear car doors slamming. Multiple doors, voices carrying on the morning air, including one that made her blood run cold. Her father's voice. "Grace!" Richard Whitmore's bellow carried clearly through the windows. "Grace, I know you're in there." Matt's face went white, then flushed with a rage so intense it made Grace step backward. "Whitmore," he said, and the name sounded like a curse. "You're a Whitmore." "Matt, I can explain." Get out! His voice was deadly quiet. Get out of my house, now! Please, just listen to me. I said get out! The front door burst open, and suddenly the kitchen was full of people. Richard Whitmore strode in like he owned the place, his face purple with fury, followed by two men Grace didn't recognize and a pale, shaking Charlotte. "Grace Elizabeth Whitmore," Richard snarled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" But Grace couldn't focus on her father's rage. She was staring at Matt. Watching him stare at her father with a hatred so pure and intense, it made the air shimmer. "Richard Whitmore," Matt said slowly. "In my house, on my land." Richard's eyes narrowed as he took in Matt's state of undress, Grace's obvious situation, and the implications of finding his daughter in the bedroom of a strange man. "You," Richard said, his voice deadly. "You're Matthew Carter. You know who I am." "I know exactly who you are." Richard's smile was like a blade. "The son of the man who lost everything to me, and now I find you've seduced my daughter." His gaze swept over Grace with disgust. "Though I suppose the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, your family always did have a taste for what didn't belong to them." Matt took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You destroyed my family. I conducted business, legal business. Not my fault your father was too weak to handle it. He's dead because of you." The words hung in the air like poison. Grace felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crashed over her. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't fate. This was history repeating itself in the cruelest possible way. "Matt," she whispered, but he didn't even look at her. "And now his son thinks he can get revenge by ruining my daughter," Richard continued smoothly. "How very predictable." "Get out," Matt said again, but this time he was looking at Grace. "All of you. Get out of my house and off my land." "Matt, please." Grace started forward, but he stepped back like her touch would burn him. "Was any of it real?" he asked, his voice broken. "Or was this all part of some plan? Daddy's little girl seducing the poor farm boy for revenge?" "No. Matt, it wasn't like that, I swear." "You're a Whitmore," he said, and the way he said her name made Grace's heart shatter. "That's all I need to know." Richard grabbed Grace's arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "We're leaving, now." Grace tried to pull free, tried to reach Matt, tried to make him understand. It wasn't a lie. What we shared, it was real. But Matt had already turned away, staring out the window at the fields beyond. His shoulders were rigid with pain and fury, and Grace knew with devastating certainty that she had lost him. "Move!" Richard hissed, dragging her toward the door. As they reached the threshold, Grace heard Matt's voice one more time, so quiet she almost missed it. David was right. Whitmores destroy everything they touch. The last thing Grace saw before Richard shoved her into the car was Matt standing alone in his kitchen, surrounded by broken coffee cups and shattered dreams, looking like a man who had just lost everything that mattered. Again. The ride back to Dallas passed in a haze of tears and recriminations. Grace sat pressed against the car window, watching the Texas countryside blur past, while her father's voice washed over her in waves of fury and disappointment. 21 years, Richard was saying, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. 21 years I've protected you, provided for you, built a future for you, and this is how you repay me? By throwing yourself at the first man who shows you attention? It wasn't like that, Grace whispered, but her voice was lost in the storm of his rage. Do you have any idea what you've done? The Blackwood Alliance is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Jonathan Blackwood was going to propose next month. And you've thrown it all away for what? A roll in the hay with some bitter farmer who probably saw your name in the paper and decided to get his revenge? Each word was like a physical blow, but Grace forced herself to speak. He didn't know who I was. I never told him my last name. Richard's laugh was harsh and without humor. Of course he knew. Men like Matthew Carter don't change their stripes. His father was a dreamer and a fool, and the son is clearly cut from the same cloth. Did you really think he seduced you because he loved you? You're a Whitmore, Grace. You're a target. You're wrong, Grace said, but even as the words left her lips, doubt began to creep in. The way Matt had looked at her when he learned her name, like she was something poisonous, something that had contaminated his home just by being there. Am I? Then why didn't he defend you? Why didn't he fight for you when I came to take you away? Richard's voice was softer now, which somehow made it worse. Because he got what he wanted, Grace. He humiliated a Whitmore, just like we humiliated his family. Grace closed her eyes, trying to block out her father's words, trying to hold on to the memory of Matt's hands on her skin, his voice whispering that she was beautiful, that she was precious. But the doubt was spreading like poison, tainting everything. Had she really been that naive, that easy to manipulate? "I want to know everything," Richard continued. "How you met him, what you told him, whether you gave him any information about our business dealings." "I didn't tell him anything about business. We didn't talk about—" Grace stopped, realizing what she was admitting to. "What did you talk about?" The truthful answer was everything and nothing. They'd talked about dreams and fears and the weight of expectations. They'd shared stories and laughter and silences that felt more intimate than words. They'd connected on a level Grace hadn't known was possible. But how could she explain that to her father? How could she make him understand that for one perfect night she had felt truly seen and truly loved? "Nothing important," she said finally. The mansion came into view, its imposing facade a stark reminder of the life Grace had been born into. Charlotte was waiting in the foyer, her face a mask of concern and barely contained hysteria. "Thank God you're safe," she said, reaching for Grace with perfectly manicured hands. "When the private investigator called and said he'd tracked your car to that place, I was beside myself with worry." Grace pulled away from her stepmother's touch. "You had me followed?" "Of course we had you followed," Richard snapped. "You disappeared without a word, driving off to God knows where. Did you think we'd just sit here and hope for the best?" The betrayal hit Grace like a physical blow. They hadn't trusted her enough to let her have one day of freedom without surveillance. Every move she made was monitored, every choice questioned. "Go to your room," Richard ordered. "We'll discuss your future in the morning." "My future? The future you nearly destroyed with your reckless behavior." Richard's voice was ice cold. "The Blackwood deal isn't dead yet, but it will require significant damage control. Jonathan is a forgiving man, but his father is less so. We'll need to convince them that this was a momentary lapse in judgment, nothing more." Grace felt something inside her snap. What if I don't want to marry Jonathan Blackwood? The silence that followed was deafening. Richard and Charlotte exchanged a look that spoke volumes about how thoroughly they'd planned Grace's life without her input. "That's not your decision to make," Richard said finally. "You're my daughter, and you'll do what's best for this family." "What about what's best for me?" "What's best for you is marrying well, producing heirs and maintaining the Whitmore legacy. What's best for you is forgetting whatever foolish notions that farmer put in your head." Grace stared at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. He didn't see her as a person with her own hopes and dreams. She was a chess piece to be moved around his board, a valuable asset to be deployed in service of his ambitions. "I won't do it," she said quietly. "You will," Richard replied, his voice deadly calm. "Because if you don't, I'll destroy what's left of the Carter Ranch. I'll buy up every debt, call in every favor, and make sure Matthew Carter loses everything his family ever built. And this time, I'll make sure he doesn't survive the process." The threat hit Grace like a physical blow. She stared at her father, searching his face for any sign that he was bluffing. She found none. "You wouldn't. Try me." Grace fled to her room, slamming the door behind her and collapsing onto her bed. The tears came then, hot and bitter and endless. In the space of one morning, she had lost everything that mattered. Her first love, her freedom, and any illusions she might have had about her family's capacity for mercy. But worst of all was the doubt that her father had planted. Had Matt known who she was? Had their entire night together been an elaborate revenge plot? The alternative, that what they'd shared was real and she'd lost it through the accident of her birth, was almost too painful to bear. Grace pressed her face into her pillow and wept for the woman she'd been for one perfect night, and for the future that had been stolen from her before she'd even known it was possible. Outside her window, Dallas glittered in the afternoon sun, beautiful and cold and utterly without mercy. Tomorrow she would be expected to smile and nod and play her part in her father's grand design, but tonight she mourned for what might have been. 3 weeks passed, like a prison sentence. Grace moved through her days like a ghost, attending charity luncheons and society dinners, with a smile painted on her face and ice in her veins. Charlotte had scheduled dress fittings and flower arrangements, as if Grace had already agreed to marry Jonathan Blackwood. Everyone spoke around her rather than to her, making plans for a future she wanted no part of. But it was the mornings that were the worst. Grace would wake with the phantom sensation of strong arms around her, the memory of Matt's voice whispering her name. Then reality would crash over her, and she would remember that he hated her now, that he believed she had used him for some twisted form of revenge. On a grey Thursday morning in late October, Grace woke with a familiar queasiness that she'd been trying to ignore for over a week. She barely made it to her bathroom before she was violently sick, her body betraying her even as her mind reeled with the implications. When the retching stopped, Grace sat on the cold marble floor and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but it was the subtle changes in her body that made her heart race with a mixture of terror and something that might have been hope. She was late, nearly 2 weeks late. With shaking hands, Grace managed to dress and make her way downstairs, where Charlotte was holding court in the breakfast room with the wedding planner and florist. The sight of the white flowers scattered across the table made Grace's stomach lurch again. "There you are, darling," Charlotte said without looking up. "We need to discuss the centerpieces. I'm thinking white roses and baby's breath, very traditional, very elegant." "I need to go out," Grace said abruptly. "Out? Grace, we have appointments all day. The caterer is coming at 2 and I'm not feeling well." Charlotte finally looked at her, taking in Grace's pale complexion with a frown. "You have been looking a bit peaked lately. Perhaps we should call Dr. Morrison." "No," Grace said quickly. "I just need some air. I'll be back later." Before Charlotte could protest further, Grace grabbed her purse and fled the house. She drove aimlessly through Dallas, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. Finally, she found herself in a pharmacy parking lot, staring at the building like it might bite her. 20 minutes later, Grace sat in a coffee shop bathroom, staring at the plastic test in her hands. 2 pink lines, clear as day, unmistakable in their meaning. She was pregnant with Matt Carter's baby. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Grace gripped the sink for support, her mind reeling with the enormity of what this meant. A baby, Matt's baby, a part of him growing inside her, created from that one perfect night when she had felt truly alive for the first time in her life. But what was she supposed to do now? Tell her father? He would force her to terminate the pregnancy or ship her away somewhere until it was over. Tell Matt. He thought she was a manipulative liar who had seduced him for revenge. Would he even believe the baby was his? Grace pressed her hand to her still flat stomach, trying to process the miracle and the catastrophe happening inside her body. This baby was innocent of the sins of both their families. This baby was a piece of love created in the midst of hate. She had to tell Matt. The drive to Fredericksburg felt like the longest 2 hours of Grace's life. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would make him understand that she had never lied to him about anything that mattered. The baby was proof of what they had shared, wasn't it? Proof that their connection had been real, even if it had been built on incomplete information. The Carter Ranch looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks ago, but everything felt different. Grace parked near the main house, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Through the window, she could see Matt in the kitchen, and the sight of him nearly brought her to her knees. He looked terrible, thinner than she remembered, with shadows under his eyes and a grimness to his expression that made her heart ache. When he looked up and saw her through the window, his entire body went rigid. Grace forced herself to get out of the car and walk to the front door. Matt met her there before she could knock, his face a mask of cold fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded. "I need to talk to you. We have nothing to say to each other. Please, Matt, 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Something in her voice must have gotten through to him because he stepped back and allowed her to enter. But he kept his distance, his arms crossed over his chest like a barrier between them. "Talk," he said curtly. Grace took a shaky breath. There was no easy way to say this, no gentle way to deliver news that would change both their lives forever. "I'm pregnant." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Matt's face went completely white, then flushed with color as he stared at her. "Pregnant," he repeated slowly. "Yes, and you're saying it's mine." The doubt in his voice cut Grace to the bone. "Of course it's yours. There's never been anyone else, Matt. You were my first, my only." Matt turned away from her, running his hands through his hair. "How convenient." "What? How convenient that Richard Whitmore's daughter shows up pregnant right when Daddy needs to secure a business deal. What's the plan, Grace? Claim the baby is mine to force some kind of settlement? Or maybe blackmail? Each word was like a physical blow. Grace stared at him in shock, unable to believe this was the same man who had held her so tenderly just weeks ago. How can you say that? How can you think that? Matt whirled to face her, his eyes blazing. Because you're a Whitmore, because everything your family touches turns to poison, because I was an idiot to think that one night could be real when everything else about you was a lie. I never lied to you. You never told me who you were, because I wanted one night where I wasn't defined by my father's name. Grace's voice broke. One night where I could just be Grace, not Grace Whitmore, not Richard's daughter, not a pawn in someone else's game. I thought you understood that. What I understand is that you used me, Matt said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. You came here, you seduced me, and now you're back with some sob story about being pregnant to manipulate me into, what? Marrying you? Paying you off? I don't want anything from you, Grace said quietly. I just thought you had a right to know that you're going to be a father. Matt stared at her for a long moment, and Grace caught a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with beneath the anger and pain. Get out, he said finally, but his voice was tired rather than furious. Matt, just go, Grace. Go back to your father and your mansion and your perfect life. Leave me the hell alone. Grace stood there for another moment, hoping he would change his mind, hoping he would see past his prejudice and pain to the truth she was offering him. But Matt had already turned away, his shoulders rigid with rejection. I love you, she whispered. Matt's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't turn around. No, you don't. Love requires trust, and trust requires truth. We never had either. Grace left then, because there was nothing else to say. As she drove away from the ranch, tears streaming down her face, she pressed one hand to her stomach. It's going to be just you and me, little one, she whispered, but I promise I'll love you enough for both of us. Behind her, the Carter ranch disappeared into the distance, taking with it the last of her naive hopes for a fairy tale ending. Grace knew she was running out of time the moment she walked back into the Whitmore mansion. Charlotte took one look at her tear-stained face and pale complexion and immediately went into crisis management mode. Darling, you look absolutely dreadful. I'm calling Dr. Morrison right now. No, Grace said quickly, but Charlotte was already reaching for her phone. Nonsense. You've been unwell for weeks. Richard will have my head if something happens to you before the engagement party. The engagement party. Grace had managed to forget about the elaborate affair Charlotte had planned for the following weekend, where Jonathan Blackwood would officially propose in front of 300 of Dallas society's elite. The thought of it now made her physically ill. Charlotte, I can't marry Jonathan. Her stepmother paused in her dialing, looking at Grace with sharp, calculating eyes. Of course you can, darling. Pre-wedding nerves are perfectly normal. Every bride goes through this. I'm not his bride. I'm pregnant with another man's child. The words fell into the opulent foyer like grenades. Charlotte's phone clattered to the marble floor, the sound echoing off the crystal chandelier above their heads. What did you say? Grace lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. I'm pregnant, and the father is Matthew Carter. Charlotte's face cycled through shock, horror, and finally a cold fury that reminded Grace uncomfortably of her father. That's impossible. You were only gone for one night. One night was enough. You stupid, stupid girl. Charlotte's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the force of a scream. Do you have any idea what you've done? The Blackwood alliance is worth more than you could possibly understand. Your father has built his entire expansion strategy around that marriage. Then he'll have to find another strategy. There is no other strategy. Charlotte's composure finally cracked. The business is leveraged to the hilt on the assumption of Blackwood backing. Without that marriage, without their investment, we could lose everything. Grace stared at her stepmother, beginning to understand the true scope of what her father had risked on her compliance. Everything? The house, the businesses, the lifestyle you've taken for granted your entire life. All of it. Charlotte gripped Grace's shoulders, her fingers digging in painfully. You have to fix this. You have to make this pregnancy go away. No. Grace, be reasonable. It's just a collection of cells at this point. No one ever needs to know. I said no. Charlotte released her with a disgusted sound. "Then we'll send you away. A nice private clinic in Switzerland, maybe. You can have the baby quietly and give it up for adoption. You'll be back in time for a spring wedding." "I'm not giving up my baby," Grace said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I'm not marrying Jonathan Blackwood." "You'll do both if you know what's good for you," Charlotte hissed. "Because if you don't, your father will destroy Matthew Carter so thoroughly that there won't be enough left of him to fill a coffin." The threat hit Grace like a physical blow, but this time she was ready for it. "Then I'll tell Matt everything. I'll warn him." "And say what?" "That you're carrying his bastard child. That man already thinks you're a lying manipulator." "What makes you think he'll believe anything you say now?" The truth of that statement cut deep, but Grace pushed the pain aside. There had to be a way to protect both her baby and the man she loved, even if he didn't love her back. "I need time to think." "You have until your father gets home," Charlotte said coldly. "He's in Austin for the day, but when he returns, you'll tell him that you've come to your senses, that you're ready to marry Jonathan and be the daughter he raised you to be." Grace nodded, but only to buy herself time. She went to her room and locked the door, then immediately began making plans. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let her father force her into marriage or coerce her into giving up her baby. But she also couldn't let him destroy Matt out of spite. There was only one solution, as painful as it was. She had to disappear. Grace packed quickly, taking only essentials and the small amount of cash she kept in her jewelry box. The trust fund her mother had left her wouldn't be accessible until she was 25, but she had enough to get by for a while if she was careful. As she folded clothes into her suitcase, Grace's hands lingered on the cream dress she had worn to the Harvest Festival. The fabric still smelled faintly of wood smoke and autumn air, carrying with it the memory of Matt's hands removing it with such exquisite care. She would probably never see him again, but at least their child would be safe. At least he would be safe. Grace was about to close the suitcase when her fingers found the small velvet box hidden in the back of her dresser drawer. Inside was her mother's wedding ring, not the massive diamond Richard had replaced it with when he remarried, but the simple gold band Eleanor had worn when she married for love rather than money. Grace slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if her mother had known this day would come. A car door slammed in the driveway below. Grace looked out her window and felt her blood turn to ice. Richard was home early, and he wasn't alone. Jonathan Blackwood stood beside him, looking every inch the perfect son-in-law in his expensive suit and practiced smile. They were coming to force the engagement tonight. Grace grabbed her suitcase and purse, her heart racing as she heard voices in the foyer below. She had maybe 5 minutes before someone came looking for her. She slipped out of her room and down the servants' staircase, the same route she had used as a child when she wanted to avoid her father's attention. The kitchen was empty. The staff had been dismissed early in preparation for the family dinner Charlotte had undoubtedly planned. Grace made it to her car without being seen, but as she started the engine, she caught sight of Richard's face in the mansion's front window. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw the exact moment he realized what was happening. His mouth opened in a shout she couldn't hear through the glass, and he began moving toward the front door. Grace floored the accelerator, her small car leaping forward as Richard burst onto the front steps behind her. In her rearview mirror, she watched her father's face contort with rage as she disappeared into the Dallas twilight. She was free, but freedom came at a terrible price. Grace drove through the night, heading nowhere in particular, just away from the life that had tried to cage her. As dawn broke over the Texas countryside, she finally pulled over at a small roadside diner and allowed herself to cry. She was alone, pregnant, and essentially homeless. The man she loved thought she was a manipulative liar. Her family would never forgive her defiance. But for the first time in her life, Grace was free to make her own choices. And her first choice was to protect the innocent life growing inside her, no matter what it cost. She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the first flutter of what might have been movement, or might have been hope. "We're going to be okay, little one," she whispered. "I don't know how, but we're going to be okay." Grace had been living out of her car for 3 days when she finally worked up the courage to return to Fredericksburg. Not to see Matt, she couldn't bear another rejection, but to claim the one place that truly belonged to her. Her mother's farmhouse might be small and probably needed work, but it was hers by right, and right now, it was the only home she had. The little white house sat exactly as she remembered it, surrounded by wildflowers that had grown tall and untamed in the October air. Grace sat in her car for a long moment, gathering her courage before stepping out into the crisp morning sunshine. The key still worked, and the door opened with a soft creak that sounded like a welcome. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the windows, but the house felt warm and peaceful in a way the Whitmore mansion never had. Grace set down her suitcase and walked through the small rooms, running her fingers along surfaces her mother had once touched. In the kitchen, she found a note tucked behind a loose board. Eleanor's handwriting, faded but still legible. "For my darling Grace, when you're old enough to need a place of your own. Love always, Mama." The tears came then, hot and healing. Eleanor had known somehow that her daughter would need this refuge, had known that Richard's world would eventually become too small, too suffocating for the woman Grace was meant to become. A knock at the front door made Grace freeze. Her first thought was that her father had found her, that Richard's reach extended even here. But the voice that called out was unfamiliar and distinctly female. "Hello? I saw the car and wanted to make sure everything was all right." Grace opened the door to find a woman about her own age, with kind brown eyes and flower-dusted hands. It took her a moment to recognize Sarah Mitchell from the Harvest Festival. "Grace." Sarah's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I was hoping you'd come back. Are you visiting again?" "Actually, I'm moving in. This was my mother's house." Sarah's expression shifted to one of understanding and sympathy. "Oh, honey, are you all right? You look like you've been through the ringer." Grace almost laughed at the understatement. "It's been a difficult few weeks." "Well, you've come to the right place for healing. This little house has good energy. Your mother was a wonderful woman. The whole town loved her." Sarah studied Grace's pale face with growing concern. "When was the last time you had a decent meal?" Grace couldn't remember. She'd been surviving on gas station snacks and whatever her nervous stomach could handle, which wasn't much lately. "Come on," Sarah said, making the decision for her. "The bakery is closed today, but I've got a pot roast in the oven that could feed half the town. You look like you could use some proper food and friendly company." Grace found herself being gently but firmly led down the road to a cozy house that smelled like heaven. Sarah's husband, Tom, was a quiet man with gentle hands and a warm smile who didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Their two young children, Emma and Jack, chatted happily through dinner, filling the silence with innocent joy. It was the first peaceful meal Grace had eaten in weeks. "So what brings you back to our little corner of the world?" Tom asked, as Sarah served apple pie that made Grace's mouth water. "I needed a fresh start," Grace said carefully. "Dallas wasn't home anymore." Sarah and Tom exchanged a look that spoke of years of marriage and shared understanding. "Well, you've picked a good place for fresh starts," Sarah said gently. "This town has a way of healing wounded hearts." That night, Grace lay in her mother's bed, listening to the sounds of the countryside settling into darkness. Crickets chirped outside her window, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. It was nothing like the constant hum of Dallas traffic, and she found the quiet both peaceful and slightly unnerving. She pressed her hand to her stomach, where the smallest curve was just beginning to show. "We're going to make this work," she whispered to the baby growing inside her. "Somehow we're going to build a life here." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Grace threw herself into making the farmhouse livable, scrubbing years of dust from surfaces and airing out rooms that had been closed too long. Sarah appeared regularly with food and offers of help, and gradually other neighbors began stopping by. Mrs. Henderson brought curtains that had belonged to her late sister. Old Mr. Franklin fixed the squeaky hinges on the front door without being asked. The mailman, Jim, started leaving packages on the porch with a friendly wave instead of requiring signatures. Grace had never experienced anything like it. In Dallas, neighbors were people you nodded to politely in elevators. Here, they were family by choice, bound together by the simple act of caring about each other's welfare. It was during her second week at the farmhouse that Grace ran into Miguel Rodriguez at the hardware store. Matt's foreman looked surprised to see her, then concerned when he took in her obviously pregnant state. "Miss Grace, what are you doing here?" "I live here now," Grace said simply. "The farmhouse down Maple Road." Miguel's eyes widened. "That's Eleanor Whitmore's old place. You're Eleanor's daughter." "Yes. Understanding dawned in Miguel's weathered face. Senora Eleanor was a good woman. She used to bring cookies to the ranch hands at Christmas time, back when I was just starting out. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. You knew my mother? See, before she married your father. She was different then. Happy, you know? She had light in her eyes. Miguel studied Grace's face carefully. You have her eyes. Thank you. Miguel hesitated, clearly struggling with something. Miss Grace, about the patron— Please don't, Grace said quickly. I know he hates me. I know he doesn't want to see me. I'm not here to cause trouble. He doesn't hate you, Miguel said quietly. He hates himself. There's a difference. Before Grace could ask what he meant, Miguel tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her standing in the hardware store aisle with her heart racing and 1,000 questions burning in her throat. That evening, as Grace sat on her front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, she allowed herself to think about Matt for the first time since their disastrous last meeting. Was Miguel right? Did Matt's anger come from self-hatred rather than hatred of her? It didn't matter, she told herself firmly. Matt had made his feelings clear. She was building a new life now, one that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or affection. But as night fell over the quiet farmhouse, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her story with Matthew Carter wasn't finished yet. 3 weeks after settling into the farmhouse, Grace's carefully constructed peace was shattered by a cold November morning, and the worst morning sickness she'd experienced yet. She barely made it to the bathroom before her body betrayed her, leaving her weak and shaking on the cool tile floor. When the nausea finally subsided, Grace caught sight of herself in the mirror and felt a jolt of concern. Her face was pale as parchment, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. She'd been surviving on crackers and ginger tea for days, unable to keep much else down. Sarah had been gently suggesting she see a doctor, but Grace had been putting it off. She had enough money to last a few more months if she was careful, but medical bills could quickly drain her small savings. Still, looking at her reflection now, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. Dr. Patricia Hernandez was a kind woman in her 50s who ran a small practice on the outskirts of Fredericksburg. Her office was nothing like the sterile Dallas specialists Grace was accustomed to. It was warm and comfortable, with family photos on the desk and children's drawings taped to the walls. How far along are you, Grace? Dr. Hernandez asked after the initial examination. About 10 weeks, I think. The doctor made notes in Grace's file. You're quite thin, and your blood pressure is a little low. Have you been eating regularly? Grace flushed with embarrassment. I've been having trouble keeping food down. That's normal to a point, but you need to maintain your nutrition for both you and the baby. Dr. Hernandez studied Grace with perceptive eyes. Are you managing this pregnancy alone? The simple question nearly undid Grace's composure. Yes, the father. He's not involved. I see. And your family? Also not involved. Dr. Hernandez nodded without judgment. Well, you're not alone now. We're going to take good care of both of you. She handed Grace a list of prenatal vitamins and dietary suggestions. I want to see you in 2 weeks, and if the morning sickness doesn't improve, we'll discuss some options for managing it. Grace was leaving the doctor's office, her mind focused on the ultrasound photos tucked safely in her purse, when she literally ran into someone coming around the corner. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her, and Grace looked up into the most familiar blue eyes in the world. Matt, she breathed. He stared down at her, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and something that might have been concern when he took in her obvious weight loss and pale complexion. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in the strange intimacy of unexpected touch. Then Matt dropped his hands and stepped back as if she'd burned him. What are you doing here? He asked roughly. I had an appointment. Grace gestured vaguely toward the medical building behind her. Matt's gaze dropped to her slightly rounded belly, visible now beneath her fitted sweater, and something painful flickered across his features. How are you feeling? The question seemed to surprise him as much as it did Grace. I'm fine, she said automatically, then caught herself. Actually, I'm not fine. I'm tired and sick and scared most of the time, but the baby is healthy, so I guess that's what matters. Grace, I should go, she said quickly, not wanting to endure another rejection. I don't want to keep you from your appointment. I'm not here for an appointment. I was visiting Mrs. Chen. She had surgery last week. Matt's voice was gentler now, almost reluctant. You look like you've lost weight. Dr. Hernandez says it's normal in the first trimester. Dr. Hernandez is good. She delivered half the babies in this county. Matt paused, seeming to struggle with himself. Are you taking care of yourself? The question, asked with such careful restraint, nearly broke Grace's heart. This was the Matt she remembered, the one who had held her tenderly and whispered sweet promises in the dark. But then his expression hardened, as if he'd caught himself showing weakness. Not that it's any of my business, he added coldly. No, Grace said quietly. I suppose it isn't. They stood there for another moment, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Grace wanted to tell him about the farmhouse, about how she'd made it into a real home. She wanted to tell him about the neighbors who had welcomed her without question, about the way she sometimes caught herself humming lullabies while she worked in the garden. Most of all, she wanted to tell him that she loved him, that she had never stopped loving him, that their baby moved when she played music, and she thought maybe he or she recognized the voice that had once whispered endearments against Grace's skin. Instead, she said, I'm living in my mother's farmhouse now, on Maple Road, in case you were wondering. Matt's jaw tightened. I wasn't. Of course not. Grace forced a smile. Take care of yourself, Matt. She walked away before he could respond, her back straight and her chin high. She didn't look back, didn't let him see the tears that threatened to spill over, but she could feel his eyes on her until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. That afternoon, Grace was working in her garden when she heard a truck in the driveway. Her heart leaped, hoping it might be Matt, but when she looked up, she saw Miguel Rodriguez climbing out of a ranch pickup. Miss Grace, he said, tipping his hat, I hope you don't mind the visit. Of course not. Can I get you some coffee? No, thank you. I can't stay long. Miguel looked uncomfortable, like a man wrestling with his conscience. I wanted to talk to you about the patron. Miguel, please let me say this. I've worked for the Carter family for 15 years. I knew Matt's father, his brother. Good men, but broken by what happened with your father. Grace winced, but Miguel continued gently. Matt, he's been angry for so long he doesn't remember how to be anything else. But since you left, Miguel shook his head. He's like a man haunted. He works from dawn to midnight, never eats unless I force him to, never sleeps. Yesterday I found him standing in the spot where you danced at the festival, just staring at nothing. Why are you telling me this? Because you're both suffering, and it's foolish. Whatever happened between your families, it has nothing to do with what you and Matt feel for each other. He doesn't feel anything for me, Grace said softly. He made that very clear. Did he? Miguel studied her face. Or did he make it clear that he doesn't trust what he feels? Before Grace could respond, Miguel climbed back into his truck. The patron is a good man, Miss Grace, but he's been hurt so much that he's forgotten how to accept good things when they come to him. Maybe he needs someone to remind him. As Miguel drove away, Grace stood in her garden, with her hand pressed to her growing belly. Maybe Miguel was right. Maybe Matt was as miserable as she was, trapped by pride and old wounds that had nothing to do with what they'd shared. But what could she do about it? How could she reach a man who had built walls so high that even love couldn't scale them? That night, Grace dreamed of dancing under paper lanterns while a warm hand held hers, and a deep voice whispered her name like a prayer. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the absolute certainty that some love stories were worth fighting for, no matter how impossible they seemed. December arrived with an unexpected vengeance, bringing the worst winter storm Texas had seen in decades. Grace woke on a Friday morning to howling wind and ice pelting against her windows. The power had gone out sometime during the night, leaving the farmhouse cold and dark. At nearly 14 weeks pregnant, Grace felt better than she had in months. The morning sickness had finally subsided, and she'd been enjoying the quiet routine of her new life. But as she watched tree branches bending dangerously close to her roof, she realized she might be in real trouble. The phone lines were down, her cell phone had no signal, and the temperature was dropping steadily. Grace wrapped herself in blankets and tried to stay warm while the storm raged outside. By afternoon, she was shivering despite multiple layers of clothing. That's when the contractions started. At first, Grace told herself it was just the cold making her muscles tense. But the pain came in waves, sharp and frightening, and she knew with growing terror that something was very wrong. She pressed her hands to her belly, trying to calm the spasms that seemed to be growing stronger. Please, she whispered to the baby. Please hold on. Grace tried to make it to her car, thinking she could drive to town for help, but the driveway was a sheet of ice. Her small sedan wouldn't make it 10 feet. The contractions were coming more frequently now, and Grace found herself on her knees in the kitchen, gasping with pain and fear. She was going to lose the baby. She was going to lose the only piece of Matt she had left, and she was going to lose it alone in a cold house with no one to help her. The sound of a truck engine cutting through the storm seemed like a hallucination at first. Grace barely had the strength to lift her head when she heard heavy footsteps on the porch. The front door burst open, and Matt filled the doorway like an avenging angel, his face wild with concern. Grace! He was across the room in seconds, gathering her into his arms. Jesus, you're ice cold. How long have you been without heat? Since last night, Grace managed through chattering teeth. Matt, something's wrong. The baby... Matt's face went white as he took in her obvious distress. Without hesitation, he scooped her up and carried her to his truck, which he'd somehow managed to get up the icy driveway. Hold on, he said, his voice fierce with determination. I'm getting you to Dr. Hernandez. The drive to town was treacherous, but Matt navigated the icy roads with skill born of years of Texas winters. Grace curled against his side, drawing strength from his solid presence, even as fear clawed at her chest. The baby can't come yet, she whispered. It's too early. The baby's going to be fine, Matt said firmly, though Grace could hear the fear beneath his confident tone. You're both going to be fine. Dr. Hernandez met them at her clinic, which still had power thanks to a backup generator. She quickly examined Grace while Matt paced the hallway like a caged animal. Stress contractions, the doctor announced finally, brought on by the cold and dehydration. The baby's heartbeat is strong, but Grace needs warmth and rest. Relief flooded through Grace so powerfully that she started crying. The baby was safe. Their baby was safe. Can I take her home? Matt asked from the doorway. Dr. Hernandez looked between them with understanding eyes. I'd rather she not be alone tonight, especially if the power's still out at her place. Do you have heat at your ranch? Generator and fireplace both. Then yes, that would be best. Grace wanted to protest, to maintain her independence, but she was too weak and grateful to argue. Matt wrapped her in blankets and carried her back to the truck, his touch infinitely gentle. The Carter Ranch house was blissfully warm. Matt settled Grace on the couch in front of a roaring fire and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with hot soup and tea. He didn't speak much, but his actions were tender, caring for her with the same reverence he'd shown that first night. Why did you come? Grace asked finally. Matt was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Miguel told me about the storm warnings, about how isolated your place is. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. I couldn't stop thinking about you alone out there. I thought you didn't care what happened to me. Matt's hands clenched into fists. I tried not to care. God knows I tried. He finally looked at her, his blue eyes blazing with suppressed emotion. But I've been going crazy these past weeks, wondering if you were eating enough, if you were warm enough, if you needed anything. Grace felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Matt, I know you think I hate you, he said quietly, and maybe I tried to, but watching you walk away from that medical building, seeing how fragile you looked, he shook his head. I realized I'd rather spend my life angry at myself than watch you suffer alone. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Grace reached out tentatively, her fingers barely brushing his hand. I never lied to you about anything that mattered, she said softly. What we shared that night, it was real for me. Matt's eyes closed as if in pain. I know, he whispered. I think I always knew. Spring arrived like a promise kept, painting the Texas countryside in wildflowers and hope. Grace had been living at the ranch for 4 months now, and the arrangement had settled into something that felt almost like family. Matt had given her the guest room down the hall from his, and they moved around each other with careful politeness during the day. But at night, when Grace couldn't sleep, she sometimes found Matt on the front porch staring out at the fields like a man wrestling with ghosts. They would sit together in comfortable silence, not touching but not quite apart either. Grace was enormous now, her belly round and heavy with their child. At 36 weeks, Dr. Hernandez had declared the baby full-term and healthy. Grace spent her days reading and preparing the nursery Matt had quietly set up in the room next to hers. "You don't have to do this," she told him when she discovered the crib and changing table he'd assembled. "The baby needs a place to sleep," Matt had replied gruffly, not meeting her eyes. It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging that the child she carried was his. On a humid June night, Grace woke to a familiar tightening in her belly, but this time she knew immediately that it wasn't false labor. The contractions were strong and regular, building with an intensity that made her gasp. "Matt," she called out, her voice barely carrying down the hallway. Within seconds, he was there, taking one look at her face and understanding immediately. "It's time?" Grace nodded, unable to speak through another contraction. Matt was beside her instantly, his hand finding hers and holding tight. "Breathe," he said softly. "Just breathe." The next few hours passed in a blur of increasing intensity. Matt never left her side, supporting her through each contraction, whispering encouragement when the pain became overwhelming. Dr. Hernandez arrived at the ranch house. The roads were clear, but Grace's labor was progressing too quickly to risk the drive to town. "I can see the head," Dr. Hernandez announced. "Grace, you need to push now." Grace bore down with everything she had, Matt's hand anchoring her to something solid and real. She could feel him trembling beside her, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts that matched her own. "Again," the doctor urged, "the baby's almost here." With a final powerful push, Grace felt the child slip from her body. The relief was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the sound that filled the room next. A strong, healthy cry that announced their baby's arrival to the world. "It's a boy," Dr. Hernandez said, placing the squirming infant on Grace's chest. "A beautiful, perfect boy." Grace looked down at her son through tears of joy and exhaustion. He was red and wrinkled and absolutely gorgeous, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that were already trying to focus on her face. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm your mama." She looked up to find Matt staring at the baby with an expression of pure wonder. Tears were streaming down his face, and his hands were shaking as he reached out tentatively to touch the tiny fingers that were grasping at the air. "He's perfect," Matt breathed. "Grace, he's absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold him?" Dr. Hernandez asked gently. Matt nodded wordlessly, accepting the baby with reverent care. The sight of this strong, gentle man cradling their son brought fresh tears to Grace's eyes. Matt looked down at the baby with such overwhelming love that Grace's heart nearly burst. "Gabriel," she said suddenly. "His name is Gabriel." Matt's eyes met hers across the small space between them. "Gabriel Carter." The question was quiet, hopeful, and loaded with more meaning than just a name. Grace felt her world shift and settle into a new configuration, one that felt right and true and absolutely terrifying in its perfection. "Yes," she whispered. "Gabriel Carter." Over the next few days, Matt threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He changed diapers with fumbling determination, paced the floors during Gabriel's fussy periods, and sat for hours just watching their son sleep. Grace found herself falling in love all over again, not just with their beautiful baby, but with the man Matt became when he held Gabriel. All his walls came down in those moments, revealing a tenderness and capacity for love that took her breath away. "He has your eyes," Grace said one evening as Matt fed Gabriel a bottle. "He has your nose," Matt replied, then looked up at her with an expression so vulnerable it made her chest ache. "Grace, I need to say something." "What?" "I was wrong. About everything. About you. About what happened between us. About letting my anger matter more than the truth." Matt's voice was rough with emotion. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway." Grace reached out and covered his free hand with hers. "There's nothing to forgive. There's everything to forgive. I let the past poison the present. I let my father's pain become my own until I couldn't see past it. And now?" Matt looked down at Gabriel, who was staring up at him with solemn blue eyes. "Now I know what really matters. This, you, our family." The word hung between them like a prayer and a promise. Family. The thing Grace had always wanted and Matt had convinced himself he didn't deserve. "Matt," Grace said softly, "what are you saying?" But before he could answer, Gabriel chose that moment to release the loudest burp Grace had ever heard from such a small person. Both adults burst into laughter, the moment of intensity broken by their son's perfectly timed commentary. I think that's his way of saying we talk too much, Matt said, grinning. Wise child, Grace replied, but her heart was singing with hope. Gabriel was 6 weeks old when the news broke across every television screen and newspaper headline in Texas. Grace was nursing their son in the living room when Matt rushed in from the barn, his face grim and his hands stained with engine grease. "Turn on the news," he said urgently. Grace shifted Gabriel to her shoulder and reached for the remote. The morning news anchor's voice filled the room, professional and clipped as she delivered the story that would change everything. Federal agents arrested business magnate Richard Whitmore and his wife Charlotte this morning on charges of fraud, money laundering and tax evasion. The investigation, which has been ongoing for over a year, alleges that the Whitmore empire was built on a foundation of illegal financial practices dating back nearly 2 decades. Grace felt the blood drain from her face as footage of her father and stepmother being led away in handcuffs filled the screen. Richard's face was stone-cold fury, while Charlotte looked like she might faint. The charges stem from a complex scheme involving shell companies, falsified documents and offshore accounts, the anchor continued. If convicted, both defendants could face up to 30 years in federal prison. Matt sat down beside Grace, his expression unreadable. Gabriel, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him, made soft cooing sounds against his mother's shoulder. "Are you all right?" Matt asked quietly. Grace wasn't sure how to answer. She felt numb, shocked, but also strangely relieved. "I think so. I mean, I knew my father wasn't a good man. But this—" She gestured helplessly at the television. The news coverage continued, detailing the scope of Richard's crimes. Fake property deals, manipulated contracts, stolen pension funds. The list seemed endless. Grace found herself thinking about all the families who had lost their homes, their savings, their futures to feed her father's greed. The Carter Ranch property seizure of 2003 is among the transactions being investigated, the anchor said, and both Grace and Matt went very still. Sources indicate that the legal documents used in that acquisition may have been fraudulent. Matt's jaw tightened. 20 years too late, he said bitterly. "Matt, your father destroyed my family with fake papers and now they're just figuring it out." His voice was rough with old pain. "David died for nothing. My parents lost everything for nothing." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." Matt looked at her for a long moment, then reached out to gently touch Gabriel's tiny fist. "It changes everything," he said quietly. "Because it means you're free now, really free." The implications of his words hit Grace like a physical blow. With her father in federal custody and the Whitmore assets frozen, she truly had nowhere else to go. No family to disappoint, no expectations to meet, no legacy to uphold. The family fortune, estimated at over $200 million, has been seized by federal authorities, the news anchor continued. Whitmore's daughter, Grace, has not been located for comment. "They're looking for me," Grace said. "Let them look," Matt replied firmly. "You're not Grace Whitmore anymore. You're Gabriel's mother. You're—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I'm what?" Before Matt could answer, the sound of multiple vehicles in the driveway made them both freeze. Through the window, Grace could see black SUVs and news vans pulling up to the ranch house. "Federal agents," Matt said grimly, "and reporters." Grace's arms tightened protectively around Gabriel. "They can't take him, can they? They can't take my baby." "No one's taking him anywhere," Matt said with quiet ferocity. "No one's taking either of you anywhere." The next few hours were a circus of federal agents asking questions, reporters shouting from beyond the property line, and lawyers making phone calls. Grace was questioned extensively about her father's business dealings, but she knew nothing useful. She'd been deliberately kept out of Richard's world, treated as decoration rather than confidant. "Miss Whitmore," Agent Martinez said gently, "you're not under investigation, but we need to know if your father had any properties or accounts you might have access to." "I don't want access to anything of his," Grace said firmly. "I renounced any claim to the Whitmore fortune the day I left Dallas. The trust fund your mother left you has been frozen as well, pending investigation into its source." Grace nodded, unsurprised. Eleanor's money had probably been just another one of Richard's illusions, built on someone else's stolen dreams. As the federal agents finally left and the news crews were forced back to the main road, Grace found herself truly understanding what freedom meant. She had nothing now, no money, no family name, no inheritance. Just the clothes on her back, the baby in her arms, and the man who had opened his home to them both. "What happens now?" she asked Matt as they stood on the front porch, watching the last of the government cars disappear down the drive. "Now you decide who you want to be," Matt said simply. "Not Richard Whitmore's daughter, not Charlotte's project, not a name in the society pages. Just Grace. Just Grace," she repeated softly, testing how it felt. It felt terrifying and liberating and absolutely right. That night, as Grace rocked Gabriel to sleep, she heard voices on the porch below. Matt was talking to someone, his tone serious and concerned. When she looked out the window, she saw Miguel Rodriguez sitting in one of the wicker chairs, his weathered face grave in the lamplight. "The whole town's talking," Miguel was saying. "Some folks are saying she's probably just like her father, that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." Grace's heart sank. She'd found acceptance here, built tentative friendships with the neighbors who had welcomed Eleanor's daughter. Would they turn against her now? "And what do you tell them?" Matt's voice was dangerously quiet. "I tell them they're idiots," Miguel replied firmly. "I tell them that girl has worked harder in 6 months to make a life for herself than most people do in 6 years. I tell them she chose to leave everything behind rather than be part of her father's poison." "Good," Matt said, "because anyone who has a problem with Grace has a problem with me." The quiet ferocity in his voice made Grace's chest tight with emotion. Gabriel stirred in her arms, making sleepy baby sounds, and she pressed a gentle kiss to his downy head. "We're going to be all right," she whispered to him. "Your daddy's going to make sure we're all right." Outside, the Texas night settled around the ranch like a protective embrace, and Grace allowed herself to believe that sometimes even the most broken things could be healed with patience, love, and the courage to start over. 3 months had passed since the Whitmore empire crumbled, and autumn had returned to Fredericksburg with gentle insistence. Grace stood in the kitchen making Gabriel's evening bottle, watching through the window as Matt worked with one of the young horses in the corral. At 4 months old, their son was alert and curious, his blue eyes following his father's every movement with devoted attention. The past months had brought a strange kind of peace to the ranch. Grace had found work helping Sarah at the bakery 3 mornings a week, bringing Gabriel along in his carrier, while she learned to make the bread and pastries that fed half the town. It wasn't the life she'd been raised for, but it was the life she'd chosen, and it filled her with quiet satisfaction. Matt had been endlessly patient, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but Grace could feel the tension building between them. The way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful way he touched her hand when passing Gabriel between them, the electricity that sparked whenever they accidentally brushed against each other in the narrow hallway. They were living like family, but they weren't truly family. Not yet. "He's getting better with that horse," Grace said as Matt came in from the evening chores, his shirt damp with honest sweat. "Storm's got good instincts. Just needed someone to show him he could trust again." Matt's eyes met hers, and Grace wondered if they were still talking about the horse. "Speaking of trust," Grace said, her heart hammering against her ribs, "I need to tell you something." Matt went very still, his hands freezing in the act of washing up at the kitchen sink. "What?" "I've been thinking about what you said that night Gabriel was born, about us being a family." "Grace." "No. Let me finish." She turned to face him fully, drawing courage from the love she saw in his eyes, even when he was trying to hide it. "I love you, Matt. I've loved you since that first dance at the festival, and I never stopped, even when I thought you hated me." Matt's breath caught. "I never hated you. I know that now. But the question is, what are we going to do about it?" For a moment, Matt just stared at her, his blue eyes bright with an emotion so intense it made Grace's knees weak. Then he was crossing the kitchen in 3 long strides, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "I love you," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "God help me. I love you so much it terrifies me. I've loved you since I first saw you standing at the edge of that festival, looking like you'd never seen real happiness before." Grace felt tears spill over as she reached up to cover his hands with hers. "Then why have we been dancing around each other for months?" "Because I was afraid," Matt admitted. "Afraid that loving you meant losing myself. afraid that you'd realize you could do better than a bitter rancher with too much baggage. You're not bitter anymore, Grace said softly. And I could never do better than the man who saved me and our son, who gave us a home when we had nowhere else to go. Matt's thumbs traced her cheekbones, wiping away her tears. Grace, I want to give you everything. Marriage, more children, a life built on something real and lasting. But only if that's what you want too. It's all I want, Grace whispered. It's all I've ever wanted. When Matt kissed her, it was with all the pent-up longing of the past months, all the love he'd been too afraid to express, all the promises he was finally ready to make. Grace melted into him, tasting hope and forever on his lips. From his bouncy seat nearby, Gabriel made an impatient sound as if commenting on his parents' delayed courtship. They broke apart laughing, and Matt scooped up his son with one arm while keeping the other around Grace. What do you think, buddy? Matt asked Gabriel seriously. Should I marry your mama? Gabriel responded by grabbing Matt's nose and babbling something that sounded remarkably like approval. I think that's a yes, Grace laughed. That night, Matt formally proposed on the front porch, where they'd shared so many quiet evenings. He'd had the ring for weeks, he confessed, his grandmother's simple diamond solitaire that had waited in his dresser drawer for the right moment, the right woman, the right chance at forever. You were worth waiting for, he said, as he slipped the ring onto Grace's finger. Both of you were worth waiting for. The wedding took place the following weekend in the wildflower meadow behind the ranch house. It was everything Grace had never known she wanted, small and intimate, with Sarah and Tom as witnesses, and Gabriel cooing contentedly in old Mr. Hank's arms. Pastor Williams from the town church officiated, and his words were simple but profound. Love isn't always easy, but it's always worthwhile. Matthew and Grace, you've learned that love requires courage. Courage to trust, courage to forgive, courage to build something beautiful from broken pieces. When they exchanged vows, Matt's voice was steady and sure. I promise to love you not despite your past, but because it brought you to me. I promise to build our future on trust and truth, and to never let old wounds poison new blessings. Grace's response came from the deepest part of her heart. I promise to love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become. I promise to make our home a place where love grows stronger every day, where our children feel safe and cherished, where we never forget how precious this gift is. The ring-bearer, Gabriel, technically, though he was more interested in the ribbon tied to his carrier, gurgled his approval as his parents sealed their promises, with a kiss that tasted like coming home. As the sun set over the Texas countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the new Carter family sat on their front porch. Gabriel slept peacefully in his mother's arms, while his father's hand rested protectively over them both. Any regrets? Matt asked softly. Grace looked around at the ranch that had become her sanctuary, at the man who had become her heart, at the baby who was their perfect miracle. Only that it took us so long to get here. We got here when we were ready, Matt replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. Some love stories just take time to unfold. In the distance, the lights of Fredericksburg twinkled like earthbound stars, welcoming them home to a life built on love, forgiveness, and the unshakable belief that sometimes the best things come to those who are brave enough to fight for them. Grace Whitmore was gone forever, lost in the wreckage of her father's sins. But Grace Carter, wife, mother, beloved member of a community that had embraced her without reservation, was exactly who she was meant to be. And as the Texas night settled around them like a blessing, the Carter family began the beautiful work of building their forever, one perfect day at a time. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.